Good day, everyone. Today we are here with Assistant Professor Daniel Waxman, or Prof. Waxman for short. This is the sixth interview for the Redstone Undergraduate Journal, and it will be conducted by myself, Vincere Lee, Managing Editor. We are joined by a guest interviewer, Eldrick Cheong, one of our editors who had attended class by Prof. Waxman. But let's first begin with a brief summary of our guests. So Prof. Waxman is a recent hire for the philosophy department at the National University of Singapore, only coming in this year. Before that, he was an assistant professor at Lingnan University, Hong Kong, and even before that, he worked as a junior research fellow at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. He received his PhD in philosophy from New York University in 2017. As an undergraduate, he studied maths and philosophy at Worcester College, Oxford. As stated on his website, Prof. Waxman's research is mostly in the philosophy of mathematics, logic, and epistemology, though he has wide additional interests in metaphysics, metaethics, normative ethics, and political philosophy. So with that out of the way, let's begin with something casual. So how have you been doing, Prof? What with the recent COVID outbreak and all, you know?
Not so bad. There are many restrictions here, as everyone here knows, I'm sure, but seems like, well, until yesterday, or the last few days at least, it seems like things were going in a very promising direction. Who knows how it's going to go in the next few weeks? It seems like there's some turbulent times ahead, but yeah, I'm very much hoping soon we'll see that life returns to some semblance of normality. But I'm doing totally fine. I have, the restrictions don't affect me too much in my day-to-day life, so can't complain too much.
Have you already received your second dose of the vaccine?
Actually, yeah, I had it 2 days ago, so just I was a little bit off yesterday, but not too bad, and today I feel fine. So fingers crossed, no adverse reaction.
Nice. Okay. So now that you have indeed come to Singapore, this is I believe your first year, right? Have you come to Singapore before on any other occasion?
I visited only once before, and that was for my my flyout, my job interview, where I sort of gave a talk when the department was considering hiring me. So no, I didn't have much experience in Singapore before moving here. Just one short visit of 2 or 3 days.
Okay, so yeah. So I guess after about a little more than half a year of staying, how do you find it?
I like it very much. It's extremely comfortable and civilized place, and the infrastructure is fantastic. Everything just sort of seems to work. The department is great. I can't say enough nice things about my colleagues. Very good to talk philosophy with. Yeah, we're hiring some exciting new people next year. Well, I guess next academic year, so not too long from now. Yeah, I think everything's been really positive. I like Singapore very much. It's a very nice place to live. I look forward to the COVID restrictions being deactivated, but that's I think everyone is in the same boat there. Yes.
Okay, nice. So actually, on the subject of you coming in, so before you came in, as far as I've looked at the faculty list, there wasn't really any professor who specialized in philosophy of maths before you and Professor Piccolo at least came in. So perhaps as a primer for this interview, you could also introduce what is the field like, especially since next semester you're offering a module on it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for any subject, there's the philosophy of that subject. Or what kind of things would you look at there? Really, what you're doing is you're looking at foundational assumptions that are sort of taken for granted or operative in the background, and you're looking at whether those are defensible, you're looking at the implications of those you're looking at possible alternative foundations, that sort of thing. And the philosophy of mathematics, I think, is no different. So one of the things that philosophy of maths is trying to do is to look at contemporary mathematics and try and understand, in some sense, what is going on there? What are we doing when we do mathematics? And actually, it turns out that I think mathematics is in a very interesting position because it raises a whole number of quite deep philosophical questions that are kind of go right to the center of things. And so this is true in metaphysics, for instance. So a very natural picture of what's going on in mathematics is we are talking about mathematical objects like things like numbers or sets or functions or curves or geometric figures, these kinds of things. We talk about them as if they're objects. And this raises some metaphysical puzzles, right? Because if these are objects, then they're certainly not objects that are concrete in the sense that you can kind of bump into them or causally interact with them, or you can't get bumped on their heads by a number or a set. And so this raises interesting questions about whether we can make sense of these sorts of abstract objects existing. Is it really fair to talk about the existence of numbers? So there are sort of metaphysical issues raised by mathematics, and there are equally well epistemic issues about how we get knowledge or justify belief in mathematics. And one way of thinking about this is that it stems from precisely the conception of mathematics as a sort of abstract domain. If you think about numbers and sets as really existing things, but they're not like out there in the physical world to be bumped into, then it's a very urgent question how we could get knowledge about these things, right? So all of the usual methods that you would get knowledge about, like, I don't know, tables and chairs and laptops in front of you, involve kind of causal interaction, right? Like, I know that there's a laptop in front of me because the laptop is causing light in some sense to go into my eyes, that is being processed in a certain way by my cognitive faculties. Now, for mathematics, it's completely unclear that there's anything like that. And the more that you press this conception of mathematics as dealing with a realm of abstract objects, the harder it is to give a kind of epistemic explanation of how we can get knowledge about those objects. So this is one of the sort of cluster of issues that people think about in the philosophy of mathematics. How do we resolve this puzzle? And so, of course, there are many possible options on the table. You can compromise the conception of mathematics as a study of abstract objects. You can say some things about the epistemology, but this is just one of, for instance, many issues. Just to give more of a sense of it, another issue that I am particularly interested in is what I think of as regarding the objectivity or determinacy of mathematics. So just as a naive introduction to the subjects, some facts seem objective, or some claims seem objectively true, and some seem sort of less objectively true. So, for instance, it seems plausibly quite objectively true that there's a laptop in front of me, but I don't know, pizza is delicious. I think that's true, but there's a sense in which it doesn't seem like objectively true. Like, pizza is delicious, I would endorse that. I think pizza really is delicious, but I can understand someone disagreeing with me, and there's no obvious grounds for saying that someone who says no, pizza is disgusting, is objectively making a mistake. It seems like there's something kind of soft or non-objective about these sorts of discourse. And one question in mathematics is, how objective are mathematical claims? And so on the one hand, there's a sense that, well, how could anything be more objective than mathematics? If I say 2 + 2 = 4, that seems not only true, but anyone who disagrees with that seems to be making a natural, naive mistake, right? If someone says, no, 2 + 2 is 5, I would say either you're just wrong, you've made a mistake in your calculations, or you just mean something different by the words that you're using. So it seems like there are some mathematical claims that are just completely objective. But then one of the interesting things in the philosophy of mathematics is how to kind of extend this picture to what I think of as research level mathematics. So research level mathematics is not doing things like 2 + 2 = 4. It's looking at the implications of some relatively complex axiom schemes, sets of axioms that people work in. And one of the questions is, how do we justify those axioms? And one of the implications of this is, well, so one of the additional questions you might investigate is, are these axioms really objective? So, for instance, some of the axioms include, in contemporary mathematics, include an axiom of infinity. So an axiom that says there exist infinitely many objects. And you might think, well, that is not completely obvious. And what if somebody came along and said, I want to study mathematics that investigates if there's not infinitely many objects? Would they be making an objective mistake? And the question becomes even more pressing when you look at some of the most significant technical phenomena in the foundations of mathematics. And so these are independence results, which, just to give a very basic introduction to them, the most natural ways of thinking about mathematics, we have a sort of set of axioms. These are like basic theories. And one of the landmark discoveries is that for any reasonable set of axioms that you write down, there are going to be questions that those axioms do not decide. Right, so such that you cannot prove claims such that you cannot prove them from the axioms, nor can you prove their negation. And one question is, with claims like this, you can't prove them from your axioms, you can't prove their negation. How should we think about these? So one option is to extend your axioms. You can add new axioms maybe that will resolve these questions. But then again, the question comes up, well, maybe there are two different ways of extending your axioms and they're incompatible with one another. So what motivates that choice? Is there an objective choice between these two? Is it kind of the sort of situation where, oh, I could go one way or I could go the other, and there's nothing kind of objectively to determine which? These are the sort of cluster of questions that I find quite interesting as well. I'm sorry, that was maybe too long for an introduction, but I hope that gives a sense of some of the many fascinating issues.
No, it's not too long. It is broad, which is a good overview of the subject as a whole. How about for yourself, LJ? Do you have any questions about?
Yeah, I suppose, Prof. Waxman, more on a related note, I'm just wondering, as a student in general, if there's any, I guess, kind of relation between what is being done in, say, the pure math department universities and what's being done in philosophy of mathematics. So does say that the existence of sets or mathematical objects, does it inform research in, say, pure math in any way? Or do you think that it ought to inform them, or it actually does?
Yeah, so absolutely, I think there's overlap. So let me just give you one sort of set of examples. So the question I was just talking about new axioms, right? So we have the axioms that are commonly accepted are called, for what it's worth, they're called Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Just say set theory for short. And so we know for a fact that set theory does not decide certain very deep and interesting questions about the nature of sets. So one of these, for instance, I don't know if you've heard of this, is the continuum hypothesis. So I don't know if you know, there are different sizes of infinity. This is something that's often explained in an introductory philosophy course. There, you can take the infinity that consists of the natural numbers as one, and then you can take the infinity that's sort of the size of the real numbers as another. And now one question is, are there sizes of infinity that kind of lie in between these two? This is effectively the continuum hypothesis. Says that the continuum hypothesis says there are no sizes of infinity that lie in between these two. And this is independent of our axioms. So this is a question people, this is one of the first questions that comes up really when people started doing set theory. A man named Georg Cantor, who really was one of the first sort of people to study set theory in its own sense. This is one of the first things he tried to prove, and he spent, of course, failed to prove it because it's actually unprovable from the axioms. Now, so one question is, now we know that we cannot prove this. Can we supplement our axioms? Can we add new axioms that are in some way justified, that do settle the question? And then, of course, the answer to this is going to depend on how we think of these axioms being justified. And this is, to answer your question, this is where I think work in pure mathematics comes in, because there are people working in set theory and other related areas of sort of pure mathematics. And what they're doing, in effect, is just looking at the consequences of, they're coming up with new possible axiom candidates, new statements that you can add to the axioms of set theory, and they're deriving the consequences of these. So they're looking at what are the consequences of these axioms? What kind of things can you prove? And there's a very popular line of thought which says, well, if we're going to justify a new axiom somehow, the justification has to be in some sense holistic. It has to come from considerations like, well, if we added this new axiom, would we be able to resolve old questions in a way that looks theoretically appealing? Are these new axioms fruitful? Do they explain things that we would like to explain? Things like this. And so when you were trying to adjudicate the case for accepting a particular new axiom candidate, absolutely, the thing to do is to talk to your colleagues in the pure mathematics department and see, well, what exactly does this new axiom do for us in mathematics? So that's just one area where I think, yes, there's a potential for a lot of, and in fact, in practice, there is a lot of interaction. There are so many people working in precisely this intersection, and it would be kind of, you could call them set theorists, you could call them philosophers of mathematics. They're straddling the boundary. That's just one example, yeah.
Right. Sorry. Yes, very interesting. Actually, on the subject of this, of this, I understand you have certain papers, right, coming up, or at least in the process of drafting. Could you introduce us to any one of them in particular? that has captured your interest, your current research at least?
Sure. So I can tell you one strand of my work, which I wonder if the background is too much to get into, but I can give you a very short gloss on the background. So some of you may have heard of Gödel, who has these famous incompleteness theorems. Very roughly, what Gödel's incompleteness theorems show is that let's take a mathematical theory. Let's imagine that it's at least has a certain level of strength, minimal level of strength. And now there's a striking question of whether that theory is consistent. What does it mean for a theory to be consistent? It just means it doesn't prove some sentence and also prove that sentence's negation. Okay, so a theory is consistent if it sort of doesn't prove incompatible things. Now, it's one of the most natural questions you can ask. Someone gives you some mathematical theory, maybe the first question you ask is that theory true? Are the axioms true? But then a very natural sort of following question is that theory consistent, right? Even if the theory is not true, it might still be consistent, of course, right? You can have consistent false theories, and at least in naive ways of thinking. So this question of the consistency of the theory is very natural. And what Gödel showed in effect is that any theory that is in fact consistent cannot prove its own consistency. This is, of course, skipping over some subtleties in the formulation, but that's, I think, a fair way of putting what Gödel showed. Any theory that's consistent cannot prove its own consistency. And so one of the questions I'm interested in investigating is, for many of our best mathematical theories, we seem to have a pretty strong belief that they are in fact consistent, right? So we take the axioms that govern arithmetic, the theory of numbers. The most commonly formulated version of this is called piano arithmetic, formulated by a man called Piano. And one question is piano arithmetic consistent? Most people, I think, who have considered the question would say, well, yes, of course it's consistent. And then the epistemological question arises of, well, if we think we know it's consistent, or we think we're justified in believing that it's consistent, how do we get that justification? Where does that justification come from? And the interesting thing about Gödel's results show that, in effect, well, if we want to show that piano arithmetic is consistent, we cannot do that within piano arithmetic itself. Okay, we need to either do it in some other mathematical theory, or we need to do it in some way that's sort of outside of mathematical proof altogether. And one of the questions I'm interested in is, okay, let's say we go that first route. So we're trying to actually give a mathematical proof of the consistency of piano arithmetic. Now, by Gödel, we know that this must be done in some other theory other than piano arithmetic. And there are indeed kind of mathematically interesting proofs of the consistency of piano arithmetic that take place in some other systems. And now one of my questions, I've just been writing a paper on this recently, is, do these proofs kind of constitute real epistemic advance? So one way of dramatizing it is, imagine you talk to somebody and they're kind of undecided, or they're ambivalent about the question of whether PA is consistent or not, right? They just sort of they're deferring judgment for now. And then you show them one of these proofs in some other system. Well, should this proof kind of make them more, if they're rational, should it make them more confident that PA is consistent, or should their confidence not be changed? And so this gets into really, I think, deep and subtle questions about how epistemic justification works. It gets into really deep and interesting questions about epistemic circularity. And so this is one of the papers I've been writing on. In effect, I'm arguing that one of the most well-known of these proofs by a man called Gensen doesn't actually help very much, in some sense, in increasing the confidence rationally in the consistency of piano arithmetic. But the route that I take to get there, I hope, is kind of illuminating of some of these epistemic phenomena. So that's just one paper I've been recently working on.
Oh, also,
yeah.
Right. Could you give the name of the paper for any interested viewers who might want to?
Yeah, sure. It's on my website. It's I think it's just the title, working title at the moment is "Did Gensen Prove the Consistency of Arithmetic?" And you're welcome to have a look. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or get in touch. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's still very much work in progress. So I would, if anyone wants to read it and send me comments, you're more than welcome. Yeah.
Actually, Prof, on that note, I think, I think in preparation for this interview, we were looking for websites and all, and then we found that at least there's this kind of formality to the kind of research you're doing, in the sense that it seems to be utilizing very formal tools and very as compared to, say, other fields of philosophy. This field of philosophy of mathematics, epistemology, and logic, the kind of thing you're doing is very much formal in nature. So I guess the question is, how do you see this aspect of philosophy? Because increasingly so, philosophy seems to have become increasingly specialized and also formal, in using formal tools to shed light on past issues. So yeah, how do you see this way of doing philosophy? And
this is a great question. I think it's something that I think about myself, about how the methodology of this should be carried out. So, I mean, on the one hand, you're right. If you look at many of my papers, they will have, formal symbols in them. And to some extent, I think this is just something that comes with a terrain when you're doing philosophy of mathematics. At least if you're addressing the sorts of questions I am, you need to be considering, some serious mathematics and trying to understand that, and trying to discuss that in a philosophically sophisticated way involves, getting, in some sense, getting your hands dirty and talking about some of the mathematical results in some detail. So I think, I mean, there's a lovely quote from Saul Kripke, where he says the following. He says, "There is no mathematical substitute for philosophy." And I think that is also completely correct. So while I think that it's really important to, if you're studying something like the philosophy of mathematics, it's really important to understand and use formalism to the extent that it's needed. That doesn't constitute a replacement for doing the hard work of philosophical, analysis, philosophical judgment, philosophical argumentation. So basically, I have this sort of ambivalent. If you ask me, am I in favor of formalism in philosophy? In some sense, yes, of course. When it needs to be there, it needs to be there, and you couldn't do the subject properly without it. But there's also the potential for misusing it, or maybe equivalently, there's a potential for sort of losing sight of the fundamental philosophical questions that you're interested in, and putting forward some kind of formal surrogate, losing sight of the deep philosophical questions in a thicket of formalism, as it were. That is something I worry about and I try to avoid in my own work. And I think it does happen in some places. It seems like in some areas, at least in some particular instances, people are more concerned with elaborating some complex formalism in a way that kind of potentially loses touch with the underlying philosophy. And similarly, if you're citing a formal theorem in your work, you still need to make the case that this is philosophically relevant. The theorem on its own doesn't do any philosophical work. Gödel's theorem is argued by many to be extremely philosophically significant, but the theorem itself is just a piece of mathematics. If you want to get some philosophical juice out of it, so to speak, you need to do the hard philosophical work of trying to explore the implications of it. So yeah, so I have that is my attitude towards formalism. It's extremely important in many cases, but there is the potential for misuse, and that's something I strive to avoid in my own work. Yeah.
Actually, then, so on the topic of formalism and of course your interest in philosophy of mathematics, could I ask you, how do you come to get to this point, right? What made you so interested in this subject that made you want to get a PhD for it?
It's a good question. So, I mean, I was always very much interested in mathematics as a child, and in my school years. I actually thought originally I was going to do pure mathematics, straight mathematics at university, and then quite soon before I applied, I read a book called Gödel, Escher, and Bach, which is by a man called Douglas Hofstadter, which is it's not sort of very mathematically rigorous, but it traces out this really interesting. He weaves together a whole bunch of themes about Gödel and incompleteness in mathematics with theories of consciousness and notions of self-reference in general. It's really a wonderful. I mean, I haven't read it in many years, so I wonder if it stands up to scrutiny. But certainly when I read it as in the early teenage years, it had quite an impact on me, and I thought this is just the most fascinating cluster of issues. And so then I decided, oh, maybe I shouldn't apply for straight mathematics at university. I should apply for mathematics and philosophy, which was a joint degree at Oxford that allowed you to do kind of both. and with a focus on the intersection to some extent, but it allows you a lot of leeway to dabble in the various bits of philosophy. And so then I did the joint degree at Oxford. I was fortunate enough to get into to the university and study it there. And yeah, from then on, I think I was just captivated by these questions. I have my kind of intellectual tendency is whenever I get into a subject, I'm always tempted to go straight for the foundations of it and look for the kind of what are these assumptions we're working with? Why are these assumptions justified? And so, of course, philosophy is perfect for that. And I found the combination to be really a good combination. You know, the mathematics and philosophy, you might at first think that they don't complement each other so well, but that's completely false. In fact, they're excellent complements for one another, because the sort of discipline that mathematics gives your thinking is extremely useful for doing philosophy. I mean, philosophy can be so hard to carry out that having these formal tools and this formal training to some extent I think has really helped me in breaking down some of the philosophical questions I've been interested in. So I think it's a great combination. And this is what launched me in the kind of intellectual trajectory I've been following.
Perhaps, can you walk us through your experiences at undergrad doing mathematics and philosophy at Oxford?
Yeah, I mean, it was in many ways one of the best educations I could possibly have asked for someone like me and with my particular kind of tendencies. How did it work? Well, very roughly, you were doing some complex mathematics courses. So you're working, you know, you're going to lectures, or in fact, in my case, I hardly went to any lectures. They were sort of optional. The main bulk of the interaction with faculty came in these sort of more smaller, more focused classes or tutorials. And so you know, every week you're working on quite intensively on a worksheet or two in mathematics, and you're writing an essay in philosophy. And on the philosophy side, for instance, you know, I had usually it was me on my own or me with one tutorial partner. So you go in. One of you reads your essay that you've written for that week. The tutor will, you know, stop you, ask you questions. You'll just launch into a kind of free-form discussion, and it's really fantastic. I mean, you're getting immediate feedback on your writing, which is something that I think is extremely important for improving your, you know, argumentation and clarity of writing. Yeah, every time I still think when I'm writing a paper, I still have my old tutor's voice in the back of my head saying, you know, is every word in this sentence really necessary? Is every word contributing to the meaning of what I'm trying to get across? Is every sentence contributing to the overall thrust of the paper? You know, these are things that I think you can think of them intellectually, but they only really get hammered home over, you know, repeated instances of practice. And so this is something I'm really grateful for. And then and just these free roaming discussions with someone who's really kind of on top of the field were just fantastic, because there was no predefined course that the conversation was going to follow. I mean, there were hours where we, you know, one small aspect of the topic would be the focus for the hour, and we would just explore it in greater and greater depth. And yeah, for me, this was just the most fantastic way of receiving a philosophical education. I mean, there was a lot of reading. There was a lot of there was a sort of background assumption that you are going to independently read a vast quantity of material that you bring to the tutorial ready to discuss. And so that this is a prerequisite, I think, for making something like this work. But yeah, that's and of course it's an extremely time-intensive method of teaching for faculty to have these, you know, hour-long one-on-one or two-on-one tutorials. But yeah, it's an extremely rich and rewarding way of learning, I think.
Say any teachers who stood out to you, any philosophers?
At university, I think I think two in particular. So Stephen Williams was my main college tutor. He took me for many of the papers that I sat in Oxford, and he was just really fantastic to talk to. One of the most knowledgeable, you know, philosophers I've ever talked to. Just you know, the depth of his knowledge was just astounding to me, especially as an undergraduate. I was just sort of blown away. He just every topic he could just engage in increasing depth. just a sort of an unlimited degree. So I learned a huge amount from him. And then Brian King was my tutor for philosophy and mathematics. He was recently had done his PhD at Cambridge and was hanging out at Oxford for a few years. And I learned a huge amount from him in philosophy and maths. These are I think probably the two. I should mention Dan Isaacson as well. So I met him in my last year. I did a research project with him, which I think that really kickstarted me into thinking of myself as someone who could do independent philosophical research. I wrote an undergrad thesis on category theory with him, and that was really a lovely experience. I think, yeah, those are the ones I would say had most impact on me as an undergraduate.
Well, thank you, Waxman, for talking about your undergraduate experience. And then, if I may ask, how about your graduate experience? So, as stated on your website, you were a junior research fellow, right, at Oxford. And what exactly did that entail?
Well, so so the junior research fellow, that's actually a postdoctoral job. So you're sort of skipping over my graduate school years. I spent in New York at NYU, which was I was also just extremely fortunate to have gone there. It's just I mean, I don't know if you know about the NYU department, but they're just some absolutely stellar philosophers, probably the top of the field there. So the ones I worked with the most, well, my main advisor was Kristen Wright, who works on philosophy, maths, among other things, epistemology, among other things. Hartree Field, Kian Dorr, but the just the lineup of philosophers at NYU is just completely stellar, and yeah, I learned such a huge amount there just by being in the vicinity of all these superstars and the other graduate students actually as well. It's just it was a really a place where you could really thrive in philosophy. To answer your question about Oxford, so that's like a postdoctoral position that I had for a little over a year. It's just a research position, so it was really lovely. I had an office in college. I had the freedom to dine at the lunch table and dinner table whenever I liked, and it was just it's. I mean, Oxford academic colleges are really fantastic environments in many ways because they're not like departments in universities here or the US or the UK more typically, because in a department here you'll mostly hang out with people in your own field, but in a college in Oxford you get a real cross section. So I was having lunch and talking to classicists, psychologists, people working in English literature. There are only one or two philosophers in the college, so you get to talk to philosophers, but the majority of your conversation and interaction is going to be with people working in other academic subjects at a very high level. And there's something just extremely nice about that, having that cross section of people around to talk to.
So then on the subject of your, I guess you can say career thus far, it is quite interesting to note that, so after Corpus Christi, you went to Hong Kong first, right? And then afterwards you went to Singapore. Could I ask, what was that experience like?
It's been for me extremely interesting. I mean, Hong Kong, I should say one of the things that really appealed to me about it was my parents live in China, so I made me so very happy to go there. But Hong Kong was really a fascinating place to live. I mean, I'm sure you guys are aware that it's been interesting times in Hong Kong lately, and so I feel like when I arrived, I think it was 2018, it was right in the thick of that. I think things were relatively calm when I arrived for about a year, but then the student protests really started to kick off again. There was the protests regarding the national security law and all this stuff, and it just things there got extremely interesting. Let's say very fast. It was quite an experience, and one I'll never forget to have lived in Hong Kong through some of the most intense unrest there. Yeah. I mean, just to illustrate, from my apartment building once, during the worst of the some of these Mong Kok protests, I just saw what effectively were pitched battles between police and protesters. Protesters throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. Police pushing them back with batons. Riot police in full gear pushing them back. And 10 minutes later, the police move on to some other part, and the protesters come back, and this just went on all night. Someone was shot just outside my apartment. It was just just a crazy time. I got tear gassed several times just on my way home from dinner.
Wow.
It was just really an insane place to live. And many of my students, I think, were involved in the protests. Some, came into class with a black eye one day saying, "Oh yeah, I got beaten up by the police." It was just a wild time. Just a kind of unbelievable, really, in retrospect.
So then, I guess getting a request to study over in Singapore was some ways a nice change of pace.
Yes, in some ways, in some ways. I think, I mean, sadly, I'm not especially optimistic for some aspects of Hong Kong. It's certainly a place that's in flux at the moment, and yeah, Singapore is certainly much more stable environment at the moment, to say the least. Yeah.
So then, going back to your, I guess you can say your research, right? So now, within the philo department at the NUS, we do have quite a number of other professors who are interested in, say, epistemology or say in ethics, right? Which you said you had an interest in, and so I assume that you had discussions with them as well, and perhaps you uh, like bounce ideas off each other about particular fields and things like that.
Oh yeah,
So,
absolutely. I
yeah.
mean, so for instance, there's a regular reading group that the department does. So there are people who, almost every week in term time, someone circulates a paper that they've written in draft form, and then we kind of, at least when the restrictions allowed it, we would just go to someone's house or apartment and just spend 2 or 3 hours talking through the paper, giving them comments and criticisms and suggestions. I mean, this happened to some of my papers, and I thought it was extremely helpful and improved the paper, to a very high degree. And then there are just also more informal time. I mean, I had lunch with a colleague the other day. I gave some comments last night on a recent book published by OUP in epistemology, and I just talked it through with a colleague, Matthias Skipper, one of our postdocs here, and we just had lunch and talked. He humored me by listening to my criticisms and told me what he thought of them. So yeah, it's just a really fantastic, supportive environment, and there's always an ear to bend and talk philosophy with. Yeah.
Sure, Prof, on this note, right? I mean, seems like the field of academia, like what you've been doing, talking to people who have similar interests or just interests in the pursuit of knowledge seems all very exciting. But I guess retrospectively speaking, have you had any regrets pursuing academia, and also what would be your advice for people who are also likewise interested?
Good, interesting questions. Have I had any regrets? Well, I mean, so the one, I think, main downside for doing the kind of work I do is just there's no obvious real world impact. And this is something that I think never really bothered me when I was a student or in graduate school. But I think the older I get, the more I think maybe sometimes somewhat wistfully, like, oh, maybe I could have gone into something which was more practical, maybe had more of a concrete impact on the world, as opposed to just the world of ideas. But I mean, on the other hand, this is just a trade-off you have to make with, if you want to get, if you want to be on the research frontier in some subject, you need to spend a lot of time focusing on it. And for me, philosophy is something I really enjoy so much. It's something I just have this like natural drive towards doing. So do I have these regrets on reflection? No, not really. I think of them as like there are maybe some alternative life paths that I would have flourished in, where I would have done something outside of academia. But that's for any path you choose, there are going to be alternative paths where you flourished in something else. So I don't think the appropriate attitude is something like deep regret, but maybe sometimes I think wistfully of them, but not I don't feel too much regret, that's for sure. I realize that I have a very privileged life. I get to think about these questions that interest me. Most of my days, like I do some teaching. I talk to students who are interested in these things. I talk to colleagues who are interested in these things. I think through questions I'm interested in. I get to write up my ideas and send them to journals to disseminate. It's in many ways one of the most privileged lives you could possibly ask for. So really I have no fundamental complaints. And then the second part of your question was, do I have any advice? I mean, I would say an academic career is not an easy thing to pursue. It's not something that I would advise just anyone to go into. I think you have to be extremely dedicated to, basically you need to know that this is something that you really want to do with your life. And not just that, it's extremely competitive and it's an extremely hard career to actually become successful in. I mean, even since when I started graduate school, things have changed quite a bit. When I started graduate school, I was, the prevailing attitude was, well, if you're in a highly ranked PhD program, chances are you're going to get a job at least somewhere decent and you're going to be able to pursue an academic career. That is, I think, just not the case anymore. Even if you go to one of the best graduate schools, what are perceived as the best graduate schools, there is just no guarantee or even presumption, I think, that you're going to get an academic career. Maybe if you're kind of really geographically mobile, if you don't have sort of family connections that tie you down to a particular area, or if you're willing to kind of take jobs with relatively unappealing prospects in some cases, then maybe your chances are reasonable. But I think that even then it's by no means guaranteed. And not to sound too negative about this, but I think when I first started graduate school, I kind of told myself, well, look, if I don't get a job, that's okay. In philosophy, that's okay. I'll find something else to do. It's not the end of the world. But it's very hard, I think, to maintain that kind of attitude when you go through graduate school. And the reason is you're just surrounded. You've put yourself in a place where you're surrounded by people who really are sort of defining professional success as getting a tenure track job in a good philosophy department. And if all of your social interactions are with people who have like really internalized this is their main goal of being in graduate school, this is the reason they are where they are, and they think that everyone around them shares that. And it's very easy when you're in such an environment to just internalize that goal yourself. In fact, it's very difficult to resist that. And so, I mean, when I was in graduate school, friends of mine from graduate school, colleagues in graduate school who had much more difficulty getting a job, it just feels like it can kind of corrode your sense of worth more than you can imagine, because you just spent 5 or 6 years at the prime of your life, studying this academic subject and in the hope of furthering a career in it. And then, you go on the job market, you start applying for jobs, and these jobs are insanely competitive. For prestigious places in the US, they're getting probably 800 applications for a single job. I don't know exactly. In the US is not far off that, right? Of course, many people in the West are more reluctant to move, so far across the world. But even so, in the US is getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of applications for a single job. And even if you're doing extremely well, even if your work is excellent, even if you've got really good references, even if you've done everything right, there's an extremely strong possibility that you're just not going to end up with a job. Or what's even worse, you might end up getting, I've got a 1-year temporary job here, I've got a 1-year temporary job there. And before you know it, you string together 6 or 7 of these jobs, and you're just like, you're getting paid very little, you have extremely heavy teaching loads, so your research output suffers. It can be extremely hard. So again, I know for a fact I'm extremely fortunate. I have a extremely appealing job. There's plenty of time for research. I have great colleagues. But just know that certainly in humanities fields, particularly philosophy, there's just no guarantee that you're going to do that. So all of this is just by way of saying, I'm not saying don't go to philosophy graduate school and try and become a philosophy professor. I'm just saying, if you want to do it, go in with your eyes open. And I would really advise you to do it only if you are if you know for certain that this is something you'd be extremely happy to spending your life doing, and for certain that it's something that you are willing to kind of roll the die on, because you need to make peace with the fact that you might not get a job at the end of it. You might end up going into some other field. And again, it's not like your life will be a disaster if you do. I have friends who went into data science or consultancy or law, and they're all fine. But I think certainly it can feel extremely crushing at the time if you have trouble getting a job. It can feel like the most powerful kind of rejection from the field that you've just dedicated several of your years of your life to. So yeah, don't underestimate the costs that are involved, I would say. Not to be too negative, but I think that's my considered view. Yeah.
Actually, you did mention a rather interesting aspect about it. So even though you think that a career of academic is all about research, however, if you manage to get a pretty good, stable position, job at any university, you are expected to teach, right? Which would take up quite a bit of time, at least if you put in effort into it.
Sure.
what for yourself, right? How do you manage this? I guess you can say balance, right, between needing to do research, of course, for yourself, that's what you're supposed to do. Also needing to teach, right, to like create, like lesson plans or like needing to think about like what to say, right? Like how do you like how do you work out all these things? You need to mark papers, for example, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you balance that?
Oh, I mean, everyone does this differently. I mean, so people vary so much in the way that they conduct research. I mean, there are some people, they wake up every day and they write for 2 or 3 or 4 hours with their papers, and they just spend the rest of the day doing something else. I am not someone who, at least so far in my life, has been able to do this. I'm more of a like I don't know, like the way you guys, some students cram papers at the end of term. For me, it's like I have a research idea and I like, if it's going well, I can just work on it intensively for a while. But if it, there are lulls where I don't really feel, I don't know, the motivation or the urge to work so much on research, and then I try and get other stuff done. So for me, it's my research is like a boom and bust kind of thing. Like when I'm into it, I get really into it, and I'm just sort of pursuing it single-mindedly, and then like everything else goes on the back burner. And then there are long periods where I'm like not really research is not really kind of driving me so much. I mean, often in these periods, I'm still like I'm reading papers, and for me at least, I need time for ideas to percolate. I need to like read stuff to get stimulated. So there are often times when I'm in this sort of mood. Yeah. For my teaching style, I mean, I don't know how successful it is. I guess Eldrick is which class of mine were you in, Eldrick? Was it political philosophy or
Recent
the
philosophy.
recent philosophy? Yeah. I mean, my maybe this is something I've taken from my own education, but I always prefer it when things are less kind of structured. So I'm not someone who will come in with an extremely determinate lesson plan. I mean, I will assign readings and I will come prepared to talk about basically any aspect of that reading that people are interested in. I mean, I think this is something that works better in small classes. These larger classes are not something I feel I'm as good at, but certainly in these like small discussion seminar type classes, I think for me, the best like teaching preparation is really just like being on top of the field, and so I'm in a position to talk through the papers that I've assigned, and then any aspect of it I feel comfortable discussing further if the class seems like that's something they're interested in. That's at least my own tendency. Maybe this comes from my time when I was how much I enjoyed tutorials, when there was this sort of aspect of just it could go anywhere, it could address any part of it. Yeah, I don't know, Eldrick, what do you think? Did you get that sense from the class you took?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed. Vincere was there also, actually. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed.
Oh, you right.
You were the ones who stayed throughout the semester.
That's right. I mean, so to be fair to that I think that class was so. I think we had it was somewhat misdirected. I think we assumed slightly more background knowledge than some of the class had, for instance, in issues regarding logic. And I think, I don't know, I got a sense that the students here were less interested in metaphysical questions than I had expected. I think there was a sense that like these questions are kind of quite abstruse and irrelevant. To which we tried in the class to explain how they might be more relevant than you might think, but to some extent it's just it comes with the territory of doing philosophy, especially the more abstract parts of philosophy like metaphysics. It can feel like these questions are so abstract that they don't really touch on any aspects of your day-to-day life, but that doesn't mean they're not interesting. Anyway, so I think that I don't think that course was one of the most successful I ever taught. I think we kind of miscalibrated it to some extent, but I think certainly a few students seem to really enjoy it. Maybe you guys were among them, and get quite a bit out of it. Yeah, but every time you teach, it's a learning experience for us as well, right? So now I know a little bit more about I think how the students here think. I know a little bit more about what they expect from a course like this, and so things will get better. It's always a process of calibration, and as long as it's improving every time, I think it's fine.
You don't need to worry too much. Me and Eldrick had many fruitful discussions after class. Is that right, Eldrick?
Yeah.
I mean that for an instructor like me, that's exactly what I would love to hear. That the students are not only enjoying it and getting stuff from class, but they're sort of so interested in it that they take it out of class and continue the discussions. For me, this is best possible thing that can happen. So I'm very happy to hear that. Yeah.
I guess probably on my side is kind of a last question, I suppose, because we have been talking about, I mean, in line with the question about your PhD experience, how you had some, sorry, your experience at academic, how sometimes you might have thoughts about, philosophy not being too much related to the world, and then also with regards to the recent philo class where some students think that, metaphysics is not related to the world or have no relation to the world. So I guess I just want to tie back into one of your research interests, which is on formal theories of truth. And yeah, I suppose I'm not entirely familiar, but I suppose truth is a big thing within, a big field within philosophy. There's a burgeoning literature, and then starting from Tarski all the way to today. And I suppose in philosophy, it's not just a love of knowledge; it's also this tendency towards the pursuit of truth, right? I assume for most philosophers, maybe even yourself. But I guess my question would be, how do we understand this endeavor in finding out what truth really is? I mean, there have been theories that have been advanced, like correspondence theories, coherence, and minimalist theory, deflationist theories. And then maybe you can elaborate what is your favorite theory, which one you're more inclined to, and also from a more meta point of view, how do you see this endeavor? I mean, if we can't even get truth, is there any more things to do, within philosophy? Yeah.
I mean, this is a great question. I mean, I think I find truth one of the most fascinating areas of philosophy. So I've taught a course on the nature of truth before at Lingnan, and I think I'll teach it here, probably some version of this at some point. The way I set up the course, or like the central kind of issue in the minds of the students, what I tried to do was to kind of make them see it as a sort of puzzle here, which is, like, on the one hand, truth seems like this just really fundamental, deep notion. Like, what is truth is like one of the deep fundamental questions of philosophy. How can we know the truth is like one of the deep questions, fundamental questions of epistemology. Seems to connect up with questions that are just, again, fundamental to everything. Like, are there objective truths? Are the truth in some domains, ethics or art, or whether pizza is delicious? Do these truths count as objective or subjective? Can people rationally disagree about them, and so on and so forth? It seems like there's just like this vast number of fundamental issues that involve the notion of truth. And then on the other hand, it seems like truth is just this incredibly trivial thing. Why? Because if you give a Tarski-style theory of truth, it comes out saying things like this. The sentence "snow is white" is true if and only if snow is white. The sentence "grass is green" is true if and only if grass is green, and so on and so on. And so then there are people who argue, well, that's all there is to truth. All there is to truth, in some sense, and there are ways of making this precise, is that list of kind of claims of the form, such and such is true if and only if such and such. And putting these two aspects together, I think, trying to steer a line between the two is one of the most fascinating questions. Can truth be simultaneously so trivial as to be captured by these T sentences, but also at the same time, can it be involved in some of these seemingly most fundamental questions of philosophy? This is, I think, one of the very interesting questions on the philosophy of truth. I would say my tendencies lean towards deflationism, for what that's worth. So deflationism is the view that, in some sense, all there is to the notion of truth is the equivalent schema, or the T schema that moves between the truth of snow is white and snow is white. The fact, if indeed it's true that all there is to truth is that, does that mean that all of the other questions are trivialized? Well, no, I think of course not, because I think if you're a deflationist or have deflationist tendencies, you see truth as a kind of device of generalization, right? So the reason that we have a notion of truth in our language or our conceptual scheme is to try and make generalizations over things, right? So if I have a notion of truth, I can say, oh, everything that Eldrick said is true, even if maybe I don't know exactly what Eldrick said, or no, I don't have to list those things out one by one. Well, if truth is a device of generalization like this, well, then all of these deep fundamental questions, like, are some truths objective or some truths subjective? Well, these can be asked in a sort of different way. So I think the way of steering between these two horns is like, well, maybe in some sense all there is to the notion of truth is the T schema or something like this. But nevertheless, all of the questions that you've used truth to formulate, maybe although they don't have fundamentally truth as part of what's motivating them, they're still perfectly good questions and deep questions for the most part. And of course, those are questions I'm very much interested in. So yeah, I joke to my students when I taught the nature of truth. Well, you think this is about truth, but really it has to do with metaphysics, epistemology, the philosophy of language, the philosophy of content, philosophy of mind, everything. Because if you think of truth as so general, then that's the sort of terrain you end up having to work over. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating cluster of issues. I mean, and that's not even to get into some of the formal work on theories of truth. I mean, just to say a little bit about the relation between those. So formal theories of truth are often motivated by the observation that was originally made by Tarski, that the kind of classical liar paradox. Think of this as someone who says, I am lying, right? So Tarski observed that this can be effectively formalized in formal theories of truth, naive theories of truth, to form a liar sentence that says this sentence is not true. And very natural principles of truth, very natural formal principles of truth will, in conjunction with sentences of this kind, lead you into contradiction, right? So you'll get the liar sentence comes out as both true and false, which is very bad. And so a lot of the work in formal theories of truth has been just fundamentally to try and understand the ways that we might be able to resolve the liar paradox. And again, there's philosophical work here, and there's formal work here. And then again, one of, for me, the most interesting things is, well, so how do these formal theories that people have come up with interact with these grand philosophical theories about the nature of truth? So this is, again, a really interesting cluster of issues, and I think this is worth a deep study, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Eldrick, for that very insightful bombshell of a question. Yes. But regardless, so it has already been about an hour, and I think we've spent a good deal of time talking about your interests, about areas of philosophy that potential to see further insights on, as well as, of course, your own personal experiences as an academic and things like that. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming down and having this interview with us. I'd like to thank Eldrick for coming in as a guest interviewer.
Thanks very much indeed. It was good fun to talk to you guys.